Welcome, welcome.
Oh,
Baruch atah Adonai
God.
Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu
So
v'achok b'divrei.
Torah. Amen.
Well, we are sort of at the very heart of this awful, awful moment in Jewish history where the Jewish people, just 40 days after receiving the Ten Commandments, demanded of Aaron to create this golden calf. And we're here we realized yesterday that Aaron tried some delaying tactics. I want to explain that part of what happened was that there was a miscount that when Moses said he'd be back in 40 days, they thought the day that he actually went up the mountaintop was one of those 40 days. So when he didn't come back 40 days later, counting that first day, they thought he wasn't coming at all. Whereas Moses had meant that not to count the day that he actually went up on the mountain. So it seems like a relatively small error, and yet the consequences were disastrous, disastrous. And in fact, it of course is extremely symbolic as well. The golden calf could be certainly the notion that we think money and wealth as being a source of security, etc. And
All from Harriet Lubinsky.
okay, okay, Harlan, you'll take care of that. All right. So we were in the middle of discussing this process in which Aaron, the golden calf, was created. And this it talks about Masecha. It has here it is, right? Vayikach miadam vayatzaroto becheret, right? He took it from their hands. One of the delaying tactics was that he asked them to get the rings from their wives, their daughters, and their sons, assuming that they might not exactly be excited about having to donate that. And what happened was the Israelite men simply took their own jewelry and donated it. They were so eager to do this. So here he took it from their hands, v'yatzar oto b'cherv, he formed it with an engraving tool, v'yasu egel masecha, and he made it into v'yasehu egel masecha, he made it into a molten calf, egel is a calf, right? Vayomru, and they said, Ela Elohecha Yisrael, these are your gods of Israel, Asher Lucha Me'eretz Mitzrayim, who took you out from the land of Egypt. Now, the syntax is sort of interesting. They said, right? They said. So Rashi's going to have a word or two to say about that. But before we get to that, we have this Masecha. And he says the word masecha is lashon matechet. It has the connotation of metal or molten metal, perhaps. Davar acher, another interpretation. Kuf kaf hey, that's a number, 125 kanterin. Kanterin would be a measure of weight. It was 125 kanterim zahav of gold, hayubu, right, that were in this. In other words, this golden calf was made of 125 kanterim of gold and the gematria shel masecha. That the word masecha, if you'll add up the value of the letters, you're going to get to 125. Let's see what we've got. So mem is 40, samach is 60, so there's 100 right there. Kaf is 20, and hey is 5. There we go. So this statement, Ele Elohecha, right? They said Elohecha, these are your gods. Velo lo ne'emar Ela Eloheinu, right? Or Ela Eloheinu. It doesn't say Elu Eloheinu. These are our gods. It says these are your gods. Mikan, and so we can figure out from the syntax, She'eriv Rav She'alu Mimitzrayim, that this mixed multitude that went up with them from Egypt. Haim shenikalu al Aaron. These are the people who gathered against Aaron. So this is interesting, right? That on the one hand, it would appear that it wasn't the Israelites who insisted on the golden calf, that it was the Erev Rav, that it was this mixed multitude of people who went up with the Israelites after they experienced those miracles in Egypt, which would seem to, of course, reduce the guilt on the part of the Israelites, right? But on the other hand, the way the Torah says it, it doesn't, you have to sort of derive it. It's not something that's explicitly stated by the Torah itself. So again, what are the implications of this, right? That, and as far as until we looked at this passage, right, we would have said the Israelites were the ones who were responsible for all of this. So the question is, to what extent were the Israelites themselves guilty of allowing this to happen? And I would say, as my thoughts sort of direct me, that there was an added level of responsibility on the part of the Israelites or the Jewish people that this not happen, that they protect Aaron, that they argue with these people, because on the one hand, I do not believe that there was anything wrong with the fact that so many non-Israelites went up with them from Egypt because they were convinced and maybe compelled by the power, the divine power that they witnessed there in Egypt at the time, and that this motivated them. I don't see any fault in that. And on the other hand, to realize that because of the background that they had, they were not raised as Israelites, that there were going to be challenges involved in all of that. And to what extent does this also imply the degree to which they needed to be welcomed and made a part of things? I'm not sure. I think there are lots of implications that here. At any rate, this is what we learned from this language here. Vehem she'asuhu, right? And they were the ones who actually, and we read this before, is that they used necromancy, they used, or not necromancy necessarily, but sorcery to create the cough. And again, the implications of what we mean when we say sorcery, magic. For Amar Kach, right? Right? And I'm sorry, Va'achar Kach. And they were the ones who made it. And afterwards, Hit'u et Yisrael acharav. They caused the Israelites to make this mistake, to make this terrible mistake following them. So I will tell you, of course, and unashamedly, that from my own experience, I have learned really powerful and important spiritual lessons from outside my own tradition. And on the one hand, I value that and see the value in it, and at the same time hold fast and make most important the tradition I was raised with. But I do not see that loyalty to my own tradition requires me to negate everything about other traditions. And even when I disagree, I can disagree respectfully. And my sense of why there are so many different religions, even though it seems to me that so many of them, if not all of them, have a commonality in the sense of believing in some level of transcendency in a transcendent creator, that part of the language of these religions involves metaphoric use, and that different metaphors appeal to different cultures and different emotions. And just as we're all individuals, that the likelihood of a particular metaphor appealing to someone and may not be so appealing to someone else seems pretty certain. And that the metaphors that I find within the Bible and within Jewish tradition are the ones that appeal to me or that I've learned to appreciate, but that in no way negates the validity and the applicability and the righteousness of other metaphors. On the other hand, this idolatry, that is, this materialism, right, gross materialism, uh, the idea of narcissism and things like that are a terrible, terrible thing. They destroy humanity. Going on. So, new verse. Vayar Aharon. So this is we had talked about this in our previous lesson, right? Aaron saw. Vayiven mizbeach lefanav, and he built an altar before him. Vayikra Aharon vayomar, and Aaron called out, and he said, Chag Lashem machar. Tomorrow, a festival to the Lord. The word Chag, which we translate as festival, is essentially from a word chug, and the word chug essentially means circle. And the idea of people making a circle and walking around or dancing around in a circle is seen as a celebratory. That's a great expression of celebration. And that's why the word Chag means celebration, festival. Now, Vayar Aharon, Aaron saw, Shahaya bo ruach chayim. Interesting. He says here that within this golden calf, there was the breath of life, literally it means, right? Shinemar, how do we know this? Because in Psalm 106, it says, Betavnit shor, in the shape of an ox, ochel esev, who eats grass. Right? So they're understanding this verse and to mean that the ox that they made, this calf that they made, ate grass. They take this on its literary level. V'ra'ah, and so Aaron saw, shehitzliach ma'aseh Satan, that this act on the part of Satan, of Satan, was successful. V'lo haya lo peh lid chotam legamre, and so he was not able then to completely say to them, this is ridiculous. In other words, had it done nothing but a statue, right? An immovable or a lifeless statue, he might have been able to say, why would we want to worship something like this? But at least for the sake of understanding what we're reading here and how the tradition understands it, there was sufficient life to it that he could not argue. And if we were to apply that to the idea that this is a metaphor for wealth or power, we know that to some extent, wealth and power does give people the sense of power and ability, etc. And so it's very hard for people to argue against people who are convinced that wealth, that money, etc., is an ultimate source of power. So that's how we might want to understand this. Question? No. Okay.
Yeah.
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 Okay. Go. Yeah, David.
Yeah. So, okay, but taking the story back for a minute, or
Yes.
back to the story, what put the life or whatever it is within, within the calf, because, what's the theory on how it actually was able to do that, or are they just saying it's an hallucination and that never really happened?
Okay. So again, remember, I will go to this so many times that if we understand the Torah as literature, it's a story. Okay.
Right.
Now, still, taking the legitimate element of your question, right, we could say that God often tests us, that there are times when it may appear that wicked people prosper, and we are being tested to see how firm we are in our own acceptance of righteousness and divine righteousness, and not to be fooled by the temporary success of wickedness. Because ultimately, wickedness, that success is always and inevitably temporary. And what we're looking for in our own lives is success that is immortal and permanent.
Okay, I mean that helps. I guess that makes sense that God would do this as a test. My other thought was that maybe because there were we saw that in when Moses was in Egypt, there were wizards who were able to perform amazing things, right?
Right.
That so I was wondering if a couple of them were wound up in there, and basically they had managed to do this through the bare use of their magic, and that was it. But
I
your
think that's
explanation is
great
much
too.
better.
No. I think that is great. I think your analysis there is right on and spot on. And of course, in the previous thing, we say that they used their witchcraft, etc., to make this happen.
Yep.
But what I'm trying to do is to see if there's a way in which I can apply this in terms of our experienced reality.
Yep.
The
Yeah.
the on this parsha, they say, do not make your kid in your mother's milk. That means flush it and milk it.
Yeah, but Harlan, that honestly is a different subject here. So we'll
Yeah.
deal with it hopefully when we get to it.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
So yes,
And
unless you're saying that there might be some connection to the fact that it talks about seething, a calf in its mother's milk, and some connection in a way to the golden calf, I'd
yeah,
have to really think about that very hard to see the connection other than the language. But that's not to say that there isn't. Harlan, you may have hit upon something that is an allusion to that.
yeah.
That the reason why we're forbidden to do that has some connection from a literary point of view to the golden calf. Okay.
Well, Moses ground up the golden calf and told the Israel to eat it. They
Yeah.
all
So
had to eat it, and then the punishment. God
yeah,
says, "I'm going to give them a punishment," and He told Moses that they will never go into the promised land. Only their
that's
children,
okay.
and that
Uh,
was a big punishment for
Okay,
the
but that was
people.
not for this. That was
Yeah.
not for the golden calf. It was not for the sin of the golden calf.
Oh, it wasn't for
Oh,
the son.
no.
Oh,
It was a different experience.
oh,
Okay. All
All
okay.
right.
right, can I throw something in quickly?
Of course,
Sure, go
please.
ahead.
Well, the other thing in terms of Aaron saw that it had the spirit of life, to an extent, let's say that this was a crazy idolatrous act, or this object appears, but the people venerate it. And
Hmm.
that gives it a life which Aaron would have never perhaps said it could have. But the
Yes.
fact that everybody was jumping in saying, yes, it's real, it's the thing, kind
Hmm.
of gives it the spirit of life, if you will.
Yes. No, I like that very much. Thank you,
Me
Art. I think
too.
that's true. I mean, I think that truthfully, we look, perception is reality,
Yeah.
right?
And we
And
see
that's
this
and
every
that's what
day.
you're saying. That's what you're
Yes.
saying, right?
Yes.
That
Yes.
they perceived it that way, and because they perceived it that way, that was the reality for them. Yeah,
Right. Okay.
very good.
Thank you.
I don't
Um,
understand. They heard God's voice, and
I
then
know.
they didn't want to hear it again. They said through Moses will be everything. I,
That's okay. Again, that's sort of a different thing. Actually, they're praised for that they're willing to accept that the fact that they heard God, they allowed them therefore to trust Moses because they realized that to hear God directly was just such an overwhelming and powerful act, right? That in a way the Torah is trying to say to us, because people could say, well, why don't we experience God directly, etc. And the reason is because experiencing God directly, given the fact that we're this tiny little speck in a universe, right? As human
Mhm.
beings, we would be totally overwhelmed by it. It's a way of describing and trying to adequately, in some ways at least, adequately let us know our place in this particular thing. So, yeah, that was not something bad that they did. But as far as the fact that they built this golden calf after they'd heard God speaking, that is a commentary on how quickly we forget the miracles and the blessings that we have. And that in some ways our denial of God is an incredible act of a lack of appreciation.
Mm,
And essentially, that's what it reflects is a desire not to be appreciative of life and of all the blessings that life provides. Let me keep going, if I may. All right,
yeah.
let's see what we can do with this verse. Vayiven mizbech, he built an altar. Lid chotam, again, delay tactic. In other words, the fact that the Torah is telling us that Aaron's, look at this, he says, let's have that celebration tomorrow. And he's trying delay tactics here, right?
Oh,
Vayomer chag Lashem machar, right? He says, a festival to the Lord tomorrow, velo hayom, and not today. Shema yavo Moshe kodem sheyabduhu. In other words, so that possibly Moses might arrive before they worship this calf. And Rashi goes on to say, Zehu pshuto. That is the simple meaning of the text here. The text is trying to tell us how Aaron was trying to delay things in the hopes that Moses would show up in time. Midrasho, right? But on the other hand, there's also a midrashic interpretation, V'vayikra Rabbah. So in the midrash, there's a series of midrashim called Midrash Rabbah, which are on the five books of the Torah and also on the five Megillot. So one of the books, of course, is Vayikra, Leviticus, because this is Leviticus Rabbah. So it says, Vayar Aharon, Aaron saw. Dvarim harbe ra'a Aharon, that Aaron saw a lot of things. Ra'a Hur ben Achoto, he saw Hur, his his brother-in-law. Oh, sorry, his nephew, ben Achoto, the son of his sister. So he saw his nephew Hur. Shahaya Mochicham, that Hur was trying to tell the people, don't do this. This is wrong. You're doing something wrong here. Vaharguhu, and people killed him. So we had this question that was raised the last lesson, and now because why did Aaron not try to stop them? Well, now you know the answer to that question. He saw they were unstoppable. They were going to have their way no matter what. Vezehu vayiven. And again, we could understand this vayiven, which means he built, as lashon bina, meaning he understood. Mizbeach lefanav, a altar before him, right? Vayiv, this verse, we could say he understood and then made an altar before him. Vayiven mizboach lefanav. He understood, I think is what he's saying. He understood that he was going to have to offer up. He was going to have to follow through. I believe is what this is meaning, right? I think Vayiven mizboach lefanav. He understood, because the mem can sometimes mean from, right? It means from all offering on it. But for me, this language is ambiguous, and whether or not he understood that, trying to think. Is this sort of understanding Mizboach Livhanav, whether or not it has some reference, in fact, to Chur once again, that Chur, in a sense, was a sacrifice. Not sure. Just the language here is, as I said, somewhat puzzling and a little bit ambiguous. For Odra'ah, and moreover, he saw another thing he saw. Va'amar, and he thought to himself, Mutav sheyitle bi hasirachon, that it would be better for them that the The misbehavior, right? The bad thing. This sirachon also means something that smells, that stinks, right? Velo bahem. In other words, by building this altar, right, he said, "Let me take the responsibility for this terrible act on their part," right? For Odra'ah, in other words, and he also saw for Amar, im heim bonim et hamizbeach, he said, or he thought, right, Amar? Im heim bonim et hamizbeach, if they construct the altar, ze mevi sror, this one will bring a pebble, veze mevi even, and this one will bring a stone, v'nimtzet melachtam asuya bevat achat, and everything's going to be done very quickly. This was another question that was raised before. In other words, why did Aaron do so much of the stuff himself? And why didn't he say, okay, guys, if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it? Again, a delaying tactic, right? Mitoch sha'ani boneh oto, but if I'm the one who builds it, in other words, this could also mean vayiven, he understood that if he built the altar, right, umit atzel b'melachtei, and I am slow, right, slack in my work. Ben kach uben kach Moshe ba, between one thing and another, Moses will come. So we understand in this sentence that all these various delaying tactics that Aaron tried to perform in the hopes that Moses would show up and this whole thing would become null and void. Chag Lashem, right? A festival to the Lord. Belibo, in his own heart, in Aaron's heart, Haya Lashamayim. He was hoping that and he says Lashem, that this actually would be a festival to God, that it was not in his own mind a hope to worship the calf itself, right? But Tuach Haya, he was certain, Sheyavo Moshe, that in fact Moses would come, Vayavdu et hamakom, and that they would then serve God. So that this Chag Lashem Machar, when he said a festival to the Lord tomorrow, he meant that quite literally, that he was hoping that Moses would come. So this really, the way Rashi has helped us to understand these particular verses is really to mine out a ton of information that otherwise we would not be aware of. And that's where I'm going to end for today. So I'm happy to take, if there are any statements or questions for the record, I'm very happy to take them at this point.
So I guess no matter what, though, I mean, the question is, even if he'd managed to delay everything, and Moses had returned,
Yes.
Israel, I mean, they still would have been punished, right? Because they'd even constructed the golden calf, right? I mean, they doubted, right? So would the punishment have been that, maybe it would be lesser, but I'm going to guess that they still would have been punished, right? For constructing this and doubting God. So
It's a good question. On the other hand, the truth is that we all have bad thoughts. People have bad thoughts.
yeah.
The question becomes, do we act on those bad thoughts? And so there's a big difference between having a bad thought and obsessing on that bad thought and acting on that bad thought.
But they acted on it. I mean, they literally, at this point,
Yes.
you're over the hill. You're
Right.
too far gone.
Right. Right. But here's the thing. They would have made the golden calf. The golden calf would have been made, but they never would have worshipped it. And maybe that's an argument, against iconoclasts, people who destroy, statues, Greek statues and stuff. I mean, we don't worship these things. We may admire them because of the skill involved in their creation, but we don't worship these things. And it's been an old argument and an old discussion whether there's legitimacy in being iconoclastic. Okay. So in some ways, which might be an argument, might be seen as an argument as saying, well, yes, they did this, they had bad motivations, but we understand, right? At least on some level, and God would certainly take into account all the issues involved before judging a case. And when people are frightened, when people are scared, right, they will do things that normally they'd never do.
Yeah, we have lots of evidence of that. Okay, so
Right.
okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
No,
Thank you.
I think it's great that you brought these points out. I think it's really important. And with this, I'm going to end the recording.